Hi everyone, welcome to another session of Explain and Simple. So today we are going to learn about the Sri Lankan crisis. I'm sure आपने न्यूज़ में काफ़ी सुना होगा कि श्रीलंका में आजकल क्या हो रहा है. तो आज हम उसके सारे पहलुओं को जानने की कोशिश करेंगे. ये समझेंगे कि क्या रीजंस हैं वाई श्रीलंका इज़ इन सच अ क्राइसिस मोड एज ऑफ टुडे एंड how can it get out of it, and what lies in the future for Sri Lanka. Okay, so let's just get started. So first let me give you a snapshot of what's happening in Sri Lanka right now. So it's basically a political chaos. I mean, there is political chaos and there is economic turmoil, right? So it's a politico-economic crisis that Sri Lanka is grappling with at this point of time. Politically, the Rajapakshas have been ousted. Gotabaya Rajapaksa first fled to Maldives, and then then he submitted his resignation from Singapore. And Ranil Wickremesinghe, who was earlier the prime minister, has now taken over as the prime minister, as the president of Sri Lanka. So initially he was chosen as the interim president, and later on he became the full time president of Sri Lanka, right? And Ranil Wickremesinghe, being in power, he imposed a state of emergency to grapple with the situation at hand, because there were mobs on the streets and there was lawlessness everywhere. So he felt the need for imposing an emergency, right? There has been public outrage against Ranil Wickremesinghe because they see Ranil and Rajapakshas as being hand and glove in the previous administration. Obviously, he was the prime minister and he has served as the political veteran of Sri Lankan politics. Ideally, the people or the protesters were looking out for someone new, because they believe they need a freshness and a fresh breath of air in the Sri Lankan politics. However, they'll have to deal with Ranil as of now. Opposition, they fielded a candidate. All the opposition uh, remaining candidates, they backed down and supported Dulas Alepuruma for the presidential bid, which he lost, and eventually Ranil Wickremesinghe uh, has been has been brought into power as the president of Sri Lanka, and he has his task cut out when it comes to Sri Lanka. He'll have to slowly and gradually bring Sri Lanka out of this economic mess and the political chaos that has been left by the Rajapakshas. Not only this, in doing so, he will have to take some difficult decisions. I mean, he'll have to impose austerity measures because economic problem is really aggravated because of the expenses that the Rajapakshas and the earlier governments did, uh, imposing grand statues and things like that. So austerity measures now need to be put into place. So the other problem that is there is the economy is in shambles. There is economic turmoil. The inflation is sky high. You can see from the graph that I've just put here, right? The graph shows that in June the CPI inflation in Sri Lanka was as high as 55%, almost 55%. Compare that to economies like India, where it's around in the range of 7 to 9% usually, and in fact 4 to 6% is what RBI targets as the good range of inflation. At this point of time, inflation is heightened everywhere because of the Ukrainian crisis, and the food and fuel prices have gone through the roof. That is why we see central banks increasing interest rates and things like that to tackle inflation. But inflation is a problem. But in Sri Lanka, it is more of a menace. Everything is expensive. The forex reserves of Sri Lanka have gone just down because their import bill has increased because of the rising prices of food and fuel, and even fertilizers, which Sri Lanka is highly import dependent on. So their forex reserves have gone down from $8.8 billion in 2018 to just around 250 million dollars, and Sri Lanka became the first Asian nation to default on its foreign debt payment. in May. That was first time in Sri Lanka's history, and it became the first Asian country as well to fall. This is the present situation in Sri Lanka. Now let's understand the timeline of events that got us here with respect to the whole Sri Lankan crisis. Right? We are starting. We are not starting. Although the seeds have been sowed much earlier in 2004 when Rajapaksa came to power for the first time, but for interest of time, let's start our timeline from 2009. In 2009, the country's civil war ended, and uh, civil war was basically between the LTT, the rebel factions, and the government in the center, right? Which is primarily Sinhala Buddhist majority government, right? So the government started focusing inwards into economic development and stressing local production and sales over exports. So this was essentially they were looking to boost their domestic consumption rather than import substitution, and rather than looking at import substitution, or improving their exports. Highly dependent upon tourism, and highly dependent upon the two main exports were, one was the services in form of tourism, and second was in form of garments, and these were actually really hampered during the COVID time, exacerbating their economic problems that Sri Lanka was in. Okay, then at this point of time in 2009, Rajapaksa was hailed as a Sinhala hero, and from here a reckless dynasty begins. So dynasty was reckless in the sense that they became overconfident, and took on certain projects which ideally made no sense, right? And that is where a lot of the foreign exchange was wasted, right? Then we move on to 2019 when Gotabaya Rajapaksa came into power, and ever as soon as he came to power, he announced a set of tax cut measures where the VAT was reduced from 15% to 8%, and almost seven other taxes were reduced. Okay, and this single move reduced the tax revenue of the Sri Lankan government by 30%. Now this is essentially at the point when you are already in economic mess. Taking a measure like this, a populist measure like this, was absolutely unwarranted and made no economic sense. Okay, and then let's fast forward to 2021, where the Gotabaya administration made another big mistake, in the sense that now at this point of time they realize that they are in an economic problem, and the government recognizes that fertilizer imports are a key chunk of Sri Lanka's imports. Somewhere around 200 odd billion dollars was just attributed to fertilizer imports. So they said, let's stop using fertilizers and let's try and introduce organic farming in Sri Lanka. Now this became another major problem. Halfway down the line, there was no support from the people, and the crop yields fell substantially, right? And then the government had to reverse their decision, but now it had double problem. Import bill was not halved, and to add to that, the government was facing food insecurity. Government was facing food insecurity because the crop yields had fallen. Estimated reduction in yield was by 20% across crops, whether it is tea, whether it is pepper, cinnamon, vegetables, they all went down between 20 to 30%. So therefore, obviously, food prices will obviously go up again. And food and fuel are the two most important components of headline inflation across the world, right? Now, and then let's talk about April 2022. The protest began against Gotabaya's administration and Rajapaksa, leading into Rajapaksa's resignation from Singapore, as we've discussed. The problem is sky high inflation of food goods like fuel, food, and medicines. They were all unavailable. And in May 2022, they attacked the residence of the president. Okay, uh, Rajapakshas were ousted, and Ranil Wickremesinghe takes over as the interim president. So this is the timeline of events as far as the Sri Lankan crisis is concerned, um, dating back to around. We can see that it has its roots somewhere down 10 or 15 years, where this whole economic mismanagement began. Now let's look at the reasons. Some reasons, both short term and long term. We have थोड़ा बहुत आइडिया तो हमें हो गया है कि ऐसा क्यों हुआ. बट आइडियली अगर देखा जाए तो ये जो पूरा क्राइसिस है, इट्स मिक्स ऑफ political mistakes by the politicians, the political mistakes, and they were essentially, the mistakes were in form of either populist measures, or they were really unwarranted economic mistakes. And then there were certain reasons which were really unalterable or inevitable kind of reasons which the government had no control over. For example, the COVID-19 crisis, which uh, which created which really brought the Sri Lankan garments industry and the tourism industry to its knees, right? That is essentially 10 to 15% of Sri Lanka's GDP, right? This was not in the hands of the government. Secondly, if you look at the Ukrainian crisis, that is again something that is not in the hands of the government. These are two reasons where the government had no control over things, but they had a major role to play in this whole Sri Lankan crisis. So let's look at the short-term reasons. Short-term reason would be something like the COVID crisis, tourism, garment industries, which were really badly hit. Uh, 2019 tax cuts by Gotabaya administration. We have already seen again another important immediate reason. Government at the time when it needed money, 30% of its revenue just vanished into thin air, right? And the fertilizer debacle, this led to food insecurity and rising food prices. And nothing brings people together or the mobs together like food and fuel prices, right? And lastly, the Ukraine Russia conflict, again fuel and food inflation exacerbated because of this whole Ukraine Russia crisis. This has happened across the globe, but Sri Lanka, because it was already in an economic mess, this just was the final nail in the coffin, so as to say. But if we look at the long term reasons and if we dig deep, then the more important reasons would be things like concentration of power, bad governance, and nepotism. These are the chief political reasons which are there because of dynasty politics. The power was highly concentrated into the hands of the Rajapakshas, whether it is Mahinda or Gotabaya Rajapaksa. For the last 2 decades, they have been at power and they have been hailed as heroes initially. Their story has gone a complete circle from heroes to heroes, and there was a lackadaisical attitude from their side with respect to or there was a high-handedness and arrogance from their side, and they took up certain infrastructure projects which were absolutely unwarranted. And they spent billions and billions of dollars into the projects which were not even used. So rather than developing the Sri Lankan economy for good, they, like megalomaniacs, they focused on things that were absolutely unwarranted. And obviously bad governance measures. There was marginalization of minorities. The Mahinda Rajapaksa's government and Gotabaya Rajapaksa's government essentially ruled because of the Sinhala Buddhist majority, that is 70% of Sri Lankan population. But if you look at whether it is Muslims or the Tamils or the Christians, they were actually not in favor of the Rajapaksas and rather saw them as bigots, right? Then Mahinda and his megalomania, driven by Chinese geopolitical interests and money. So Mahinda Rajapaksa made a shift from India to China. The Chinese were looking at a worthy component for another worthy component for its string of pearls theory, or its policy of encircling India, and Sri Lanka fit perfectly well. China poured a lot of money in form of grants, in form of infrastructure projects into Sri Lanka, and Sri Lanka actually did take up these projects by, for example, developing Hambantota port, which today is not even used that much. Then there were stadiums that were built. There was a cricket stadium that was built. It has been titled as the world's emptiest cricket stadium. There is the world's emptiest airport in Hambantota again, and Hambantota is a province from where the Rajapaksas hail from. So essentially, they took up Their favoritism was not just limited to politics, but even when it comes to economic development, they favored a part which was actually their hometown, uh, and it did not yield economic results for them. Then inward-looking economic policy was another reason where they did not try and prop up industries which would serve the world. Rather than it was inward-looking, focusing on domestic consumption alone. So essentially, these were the reasons. Now, having learned these reasons, now let's try and understand certain aspects of this whole problem. Essentially, there are two important aspects, the political aspect and the economic aspect. Let's try and understand those. If we look at the economic aspect, let's see the roots of the crisis lie in the economic mismanagement by successive governments, and which sustained a twin deficit, whether it is the budgetary shortfall and the current account deficit because of a large amount of imports. And it's because of these deficits the whole forex reserves were just they have been dwindled, and currently only around 250 odd million dollars of forex reserves remain for Sri Lanka. The GDP itself declined by 3.5%, and its fiscal deficit is as high as 11.1% in FY20. So, so we can see from these three graphs the grim economic situation that is prevalent in Sri Lanka at this point of time. So the first graph shows you the debt the national debt that the Sri Lankans are accounting for, and you see that this debt from 2009. Let's look at this from here. 2007-8 is the inflection point from where the debt has just grown exponentially, and this is the Rajapaksa era where they they colluded with the Chinese, or they partnered with the Chinese for infrastructure projects that were unwarranted, right? And the second thing is the total. If we look at their forex reserves from a high of 9.9 or $10 billion have now actually gone down below 2.3. This was 2.3 in Feb 2022. At present, this is only around 250 odd billion dollars, and Sri Lanka is actually out with the begging bowl. Even in order to import food and fuel, it needs support. It is looking for support from rest of the nations, right? And if we look at the weakening currency, the Sri Lankan rupiah has actually Lankan rupee has gone from around 200 odd rupees to around 310, 320 rupees as present to the dollar. So the currency has weakened because of the weakening of the grim economic scenario. Okay, now let's move on to the political aspect, and at the heart of it, we'll basically be talking about nepotism and dynastic politics. What problems does it bring? Uh, what kind of high-handedness and arrogance, what results it can have on a nation's future. At the height of their power, the four brothers of Sri Lanka Rajapaksa dynasty, they held the presidency and the prime minister's office. They held the finance ministry, interior and defense portfolios, and there were other portfolios which were there in the family itself. So there is a huge amount of concentration of powers. And if we look at this graph here, or rather this image here, it shows the people that were involved from the family were not just the brothers Rajapaksa, Mahinda Rajapaksa, and Gotabaya Rajapaksa, but there were Chamal Rajapaksa, Basil Rajapaksa, and the sons, the second generation in form of Yoshita and Namal. Namal Rajapaksa was the sports minister. He is the son of Mahinda Rajapaksa. And Sashendra Rajapaksa was the son of Chamal. Chamal is another brother from Gotabayas and Mahinda. Right? So there is a huge amount of concentration of power. They are holding some 7-8 ministries, and all critical ministries with the Rajapakshas. This is bound to have some problem. This kind of centralization is bound to have its pitfalls, and let's see what are these pointers. So Mahinda Rajapaksa instrumental in establishing the Rajapaksa dynasty. He ruled with an iron fist, and he attacked civil liberties and expanded presidential powers. So they are also, despite having 7 or 8 ministries for themselves, they are also they also expanded the scope of presidential powers, more concentration of powers. Gotabaya Rajapaksa did the same, right? And exemplified by a passage in 2020 of a constitutional amendment expanding president's power to dissolve the legislature. So again, emergency powers. And the three chief minorities, that is the Tamil Hindus, accounting for 12% of the population, Muslims 9%, and Christians around 7%, they were all marginalized and in this whole two-decade rule, primarily ruled because of the Sinhala Buddhist majority, and they too were alienated because of the economic mismanagement in 2022. So during Mahinda's rule, as China shielded the Rajapakshas from war crimes, it also won major infrastructure contracts and became the country's leading lender, whose price the country is now paying this point of time. Okay, so now let's just a side note that how this Sri Lankan crisis is a is should ring bells in with respect to certain countries that are facing similar kind of problems, and why there is a need for diversification of the export baskets and development of sound economies, right? So IMF has given this warning. IMF chief Kristaliana Georgieva has cited the example as an unprecedented economic crisis in Sri Lanka to warn countries who are facing similar problems. There are many countries which are on the verge of balance of payment crisis, and the war in Ukraine has intensified, exerting added pressure on commodity and fuel prices, and they are weighing down on economic activity. And there are countries that are just on the brink of BOP defaults, right? And some of the countries are, for example, Lebanon, Russia, Suriname, Zambia. Uh, are already in default. Belarus is on the brink of default, and then some large countries like Argentina. Look at Argentina, is their currency peso has depreciated by 50% in the black market, and they are cumulative debt is around $150 billion. And Argentina is not a small country; it's a big country. And look at Ukraine. Ukraine is facing a war at this point of time. There is Russian invasion, and it has around a $20 billion plus debt on its balance sheets, which it will have to restructure with the help of the Western nations. The good thing for Ukraine is that the Western nations are going to support it because it's a geopolitically important region, and this is the least that they can do for the Ukrainians at this point of at this time in their history. Then Tunisia, Egypt, and Pakistan. Again, if you look at Pakistan, 21% or 22% CPI inflation in Pakistan. Their forex reserves have halved since the last year, and at this point of time, like a parallel to Sri Lanka, in Pakistan also there is political instability, right? So you see political instability and economic turmoil go hand in hand, especially with respect to these banana states. And Pakistan, if you look at Pakistan, their debt uh, their debt is also substantial, and around 40% of the revenue is being diverted in form of interest payments. So, Pakistan again, it needs, again, another parallel that we can see with Pakistan and Sri Lanka is that there was an over reliance on China as the most trusted partner. Pakistan also undertook infrastructure projects in form of the Lahore Metro, in form of the Karakoram Highway and things like that, with the help of the Chinese investment. But these have actually had no benefit, or very little benefit with respect to the amount that they have paid for these kind of projects, right? So this is another parallel, and these are the countries which actually, if you look at Egypt, 95% debt to GDP ratio, and again $100 billion of hard currency debt that it needs to pay over the next 5 years. Another problem, Egypt is another case in point where tourism forms a big portion of its revenue. Another nation which highly reliant on tourism. Okay, so so this Sri Lankan model, or these this model of development needs a relook, right? Okay, so what is the next step for countries like these? They need, firstly, they need to have a stable economic environment can only be created when there is a stable political environment. whether it is Ukrainian crisis, whether it is the Sri Lankan political instability or Pakistani instability and fundamentalism, you need stable politics at the center in order to take sound economic decisions. Secondly, austerity measures and strict fiscal discipline needs to be enforced in countries like these. There cannot be extravagance. There is no scope for extravagance. So these generations, so this coming generation will have to take it on their chin and you know enforce these fiscal discipline, which in our case was done post the 1991 liberalization. We had the wake up call then, and the FRBM Act was introduced in early 2000s, and we have more or less worked towards that goal, right? Then debt restructuring plans and bailout packages are going to be critical. IMF, the World Bank, and the world's leading agencies need to, development banks need to play a major role here. And long-term political stability and inclusive governance, more important is inclusive governance is essential, and marginalization of minorities always creates problems in the long term. Okay, so now in this next section we are going to discuss what ramifications does this India-Sri Lanka, the Sri Lankan crisis have on the India-Sri Lanka relations. So first we'll try and understand historically what has happened in India-Sri Lanka relations. This part is critical for people who are preparing for UPSC and HAS exams for the international relations part. This is again going to be something in vogue. Let's try and understand what has been the historical construct of the India-Sri Lanka relations. They have been very close. They have a legacy of a deep legacy of intellectual, cultural, religious interaction, and our relationship dates back to more than 2,500 years. Political relations, high-level visits from both the sides have been frequent. Vibrant and economic commercial partnership. There's a free trade agreement between India and Sri Lanka, which exists, and traditionally India has been amongst the largest trading partners of Sri Lanka. Only in the past decade, it has been China that has been the largest. Otherwise, India has remained the largest trading partner, the big brother in the relationship. India is also one of the largest contributors of FDI into Sri Lanka. FDI from India amounted to about $1.7 billion during the period 2005 to 2019. This is the data from the NEA. Besides that, India has also extended 11 lines of credit that have been given by the Exim Bank in the last 15 years. So there have been also some areas where the two nations don't see eye to eye, especially during the Rajapaksa regime. Uh, India expected Sri Lanka in the 1987 India-Sri Lanka peace accord to be implemented, especially when the civil war was done with. Uh, this basically uh, this basically talks of giving the ethnic minorities some decentralization of power should be there to them, which has not happened because the Rajapakshas, they believed in concentration of powers and centralization. This was a sore point between in the India-Sri Lanka relations, and obviously there were the fishermen issues from the two sides as well. Now let's talk about the China factor, the elephant in the room. For the past 15 years, India and China have vied for favorable diplomatic and trade relations with Sri Lanka, whereas before that, India had always had a preeminent place in the Sri Lankan foreign policy. Okay, now it's Sri Lanka, now it's China that has also come into the fray. And after Mahinda Rajapaksa took power, Sri Lanka's drift towards China was believed to be uh, they saw China as a more reliable partner, enabling economic development. And more infrastructure projects, including the Colombo Galle Expressway, were awarded to China, the Hambantota port, and cumulative value of this infrastructure development in Sri Lanka by China was $12.1 billion between 2006 and 2019. Now see how India's investment, India's FDI was just 1.7 billion. This is 12.1 billion. China has deep pockets, and Sri Lanka, because of that, when there is more money, there is more room to make extravagant mistakes as well. So this is what this shows. Then, considering both public guaranteed debt and the publicly and the private debt, China accounts for around 20% of Sri Lanka's foreign debt in 2021. Okay, and out of the 26 billion repayment which Sri Lanka has defaulted, China was owed 7 billion out of those. So this is the kind of money that Sri Lanka owes to China, right? Now, this present crisis, despite there being strong relationship between China and Sri Lanka, China has actually stayed away from any restructuring plan or giving Sri Lanka that helping hand, and it has given the space for India to actually fill in that void and strengthen the relationship with China, with Sri Lanka once again. So what Beijing wants is, Beijing wants Colombo to put its economic house in order first, agree to debt refinancing, and finalize long pending China Sri Lanka free trade agreement. So they want more Sri Lanka to do more for China, whereas at this point of time Sri Lanka is looking more from China. So there is a problem there. And also, lastly, does it wants Sri Lanka to distance itself from the Western institutions in India, right? So this is where the whole Sri Lankan thing becomes problematic for nations. That it's usually a zero-sum game for China. That it is us and nobody else, right? It is either us or nobody else, and or others. If you are going to deal with us, then nobody else. That is the problem with China. Now let's see how India is taking most of this, or making the most, uh, trying to make the most of the lost time that with respect to Sri Lanka, right? There has been a shift in public perception in Sri Lanka, which was seen anti-India and pro-China till lately. But thanks to consistent supplies from India of essential commodities in form of medicines, food, and fuel, it has bolstered by the ousting of Rajapakshas, which were really in favor of the China as a country, right? So what India has done, India has extended line of credit totaling around $4 billion for food and fuel, fertilizers, medicines, and out of this, $600 million are in form of grants. Okay, under the Prime Minister Neighborhood Policy and Security and Growth for All in the Region project, that is the Sagar project of Prime Minister Modi, India has continued sending shiploads of daily necessity to Sri Lanka. We have also sent around 65,000 tons of fertilizers and 4 lakh tons of fuel, with more shipments expected soon, right? And MOUs were signed up between the two countries for maritime rescue and coordination center, hybrid power projects, and also recently Adani also won some $500 million energy project in Sri Lanka. So Sri Lankan's attitude will depend upon how far India can go and help Sri Lanka out of this economic mess. And for that, India needs the support of the IMF and the world institutions, or the Western institutions, so that China is not required to fill in the world again, right? So this is what is required from India's side, but it is a great opportunity for India to help an ailing friend, right? So, guys, I hope this is it from my side on the Sri Lankan crisis. I hope this presentation has been useful to you, and this series of Explain and Simple, you are finding it useful. If you're really finding it useful, please like and subscribe our video and subscribe the channel, and we'll be bringing you more informative content in the future. Thank you and have a nice day.